Welcome to the Southeast CASC podcast, a show where we connect you with the science and people behind climate adaptation. I'm Maida Brandizio, the ORISE Science Program and Communication Scholar here at CASC, and I'm joined in the studio today by Caitlin Brett. Welcome, Caitlin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
The reason why I wanted to do this episode with Caitlin is I feel like I have conversations with friends all the time and they do not understand what the doing of science looks like. And it looks like a million different things. Fieldwork is a wide world. Caitlin, tell us about what you do. Why are you here with us today?
Currently, I'm working for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission as the statewide fur bearer biologist. But I've done all sorts of fieldwork with mammals, birds, insects. So hopefully I can share a little bit about that today.
And before that, you were here at NC State.
Yes.
Doing some bear work as well. What was that?
Yeah, I was a research assistant for the previous 2 years with NC State, working in Dr. Nathan Hostetter's lab on the Coastal Black Bear Project. It's this big collaborative effort between North Carolina State University, funded by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. We also work really closely with Mississippi State University. Dr. Dana Morin's lab down there is responsible for all the genetic analysis that we do. So I was leading this big crew of technicians every summer and also managing lots of logistics for the project, leading this big research effort to collect hair samples from black bears out on the coast in North Carolina.
Why were you guys looking at black bear fur?
So you can tell a lot from black bear hair or fur. The DNA that's contained in the follicles of black bear hair contains enough information for us to identify individual bears. So you can essentially use that to do this big spatial capture recapture project where you're able to identify which individual bears were detected when and where on the landscape. And from that, we can first of all figure out how many bears are out there, figure out how their density might vary across the landscape, and then also answer some questions about, the genetic structure of the population. The end goal for all this is each of those hair samples will have an individual ID associated with them for an individual bear. The idea is that we can then use that to create this big population model.
So these are black bears that we're finding here in North Carolina?
Yes, Ursus americanus. That is the only bear species that we have in the wild here in North Carolina. Black bears they've always been native to North Carolina. Black bears historically have actually inhabited pretty much all parts of the state where you can find trees, you could find black bears. But then as recently as the 1970s, I think, we were seeing really limited and fragmented populations of black bear, due in large part to habitat destruction and fragmentation, over-harvest, unregulated hunting, that sort of thing, as well as some other non-anthropogenic factors. They were facing some really serious declines and really fragmented populations. So in the past several decades, there's been this concerted effort by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and various other agencies that assisted with this recovery effort to help make sure that those populations can continue to thrive and have more area to expand into. So that effort over the past several decades means that now we have a pretty robust population, both out in the coast and in the mountains. Some people see bears as a sustainable resource. They'll hunt and harvest bears each year. So bear hunters have a big invested interest in making sure these populations are well taken care of and that the land is managed to promote sustainable harvest of those populations. And bears just in general, even I think if you aren't seeing them on the landscape every day, I think lots of people just have a soft spot for knowing that they're out there, that they're in the state of North Carolina, and that they have these pretty large areas where they can live and thrive.
The black bears are very cute, and there's some very good videos of them on the website of this project. So I will link them in the show notes. We're going to dive a little bit more into this bear field work. You're working with hair. How are you getting this hair from the bears?
We don't run around chasing bears with scissors. We set up something called a hair snare. So we set up a corral with barbed wire stretched between 3 or 4 trees out in the woods. So we have 2 strands of barbed wire in this triangular shape. And then we put a little piece of bait and a scent lure in the middle of that structure so that the bears, in order to grab the bait, they have to somehow interact with the barbed wire as well. So they have to crawl over it or under it or through it. Sometimes they climb up on the trees around it, but ideally they will then somehow brush up against that barbed wire and leave a tuft of hair behind that we can collect. Typically once the bear has already left the site. Once or twice, I think we snuck up on a bear that was still in the area, but typically they're long gone by the time we're actually collecting that data.
And you mentioned it's barbed wire. Just so everybody knows, it's more like a hairbrush to the bears. It doesn't hurt them. It's non-invasive.
Yeah. They've got really thick skin, really thick fur. Sometimes you'll see them scratching up on it on purpose to sort of scratch their backs or scratch their ears, especially the cubs. It's very cute.
You mentioned that you're tracking all around the state of North Carolina where these bear populations are. Where do you set up these traps? Is this like in people's backyards? Is this in the forest? Whereabouts are you placing these?
We did stick with anywhere where we could find trees, first of all, that were suitable for the setups. This meant we were setting up in actually a ton of private properties as well as public lands. Sometimes this meant backyards. Sometimes it was the tree line in between agricultural fields. So we worked with a lot of farmers, a lot of timber production companies. And then also, just lots of people who happen to own a couple of acres or at least a couple of trees in their backyard. We also worked with Fish and Wildlife, NC State Parks. The Wildlife Resources Commission, of course, has tons of game lands out in this area. And so, we worked with, all sorts of people to make this project happen.
As the research assistant setting up this field season, you're coordinating with all of these different people, all of these different companies and private lands, public lands. How do you go about doing that?
Oh my gosh. The coordination to get access to all these areas was definitely why I had a job, not just during the field season, but leading up to it and after it as well, because you just have to start from scratch and have this conversation with so many different people that's, explaining the research we're doing, why we want to do it, explaining what we'll be doing, especially for folks who are maybe not as familiar with the research world. It's sometimes confusing to be like, wait, so you're setting up this thing and you're grabbing hair. They're like, why are you doing all this? So it's like having that conversation, but times 200 every week. But just lots of coordinating with different people. It was sometimes having those conversations via email, sometimes over the phone with someone you never met, sometimes on their doorstep while their dogs are barking and their kids are running around. Just having to have this conversation of explaining what we want to do, why we want to do it, and hey, can you help us out by letting us get access for just a couple months this summer.
Tell us a little bit more about what it looks like to plan a field season. You're calling around to all these people to plan it. What's next?
We had a pretty big crew compared to most field projects. We had about 25 seasonal technicians who came on to help the project, figuring out who we're going to hire, going through interviews. That was a huge part of it. Figuring out how we're going to house all these people, how they're going to get to and from the sites. We had 25 trucks to jumpstart in the middle of January and make sure they were still running okay. Lots of kind of boring stuff, behind the scenes things that made sure that we could do the actual data collection in the summer.
I have a question straight from Michelle Jewell, our communications manager. What's the role of tampons in your work?
Oh my gosh. We bait the sites with a donut hung up in a biodegradable bag, but then we also use this scent lure. Bears have these great noses. They can smell from pretty long distances away. And so for our purposes, we use a fresh tampon dipped into a kind of honey raspberry flavored candy syrup. The role of the tampon is really just to hold that scent. It absorbs that scent, and it's easy to just tie right up onto the string that we're hanging the bait from.
What does it smell like? What does bear fieldwork smell like?
Oh, actually, pretty sweet compared to other things that other animals find attractive. Currently, I'm using sardines for a project to attract skunks. So, not quite as pleasant to get stuck on your clothes or in your work truck, but no, bear fieldwork smells okay. The worst you could get is maybe your donuts are a little moldy, but otherwise it's pretty sweet. Kind of sickly sweet.
So bears like donuts, which is a fun little factoid. What is a bear's favorite donut? What's the most popular flavor?
Geez. They love anything slathered in peanut butter. And that kind of lines up with what they would eat in the wild. Nuts and stuff makes up a large part of their natural quote-unquote diet. And so it kind of makes sense that they would like to eat peanut butter or eat something that's jelly-based, like berries and nuts. This is a normal part of what they eat. Obviously a very different format or very different, a little more processed than what they should probably be eating. But we let them have a little bit of donut as a treat.
Now tell us about some of the wildest things that you've experienced doing fieldwork. Give us some stories from the field.
One of my favorite stories to share happened our first season out in the field. It was probably mid-May, late May. We were just getting our hair snares set up for the season. This was a site out near Pocosin Lakes Wildlife Refuge. We knew, even going into the project, that there are a ton of bears out here. one particular site where we had marked like, oh, I think we can put a site in here. We're hiking out, and it's just this like really thick Pocosin habitat. If you're familiar with the Pocosin ecosystem, super, super dense, pretty low growing vegetation. The area we were in was just this like long dirt road out in the middle of absolute nowhere, and it's just lined on either side with a wall of green. We had flagged out a trail and marked it, and we came back the next day, and there were 2 trucks with myself in the first one and 2 technicians in the back. And so we were driving down this dirt road, absolute middle of nowhere, just cruising along, looking for the site where we'd flagged. And this big old bear, pops out of the woods on the one side and kind of pops into the road all of a sudden. We're like, oh, a bear. Okay, we've seen bears around. This one was not super close or anything, but we slowed down a little to look, but we could just figure out another way to get into the woods. And so for a while, we were actually just kind of following the bear very slowly, patiently waiting for the bear to find its way along its trail. So she eventually found a spot, dove into the woods, and of course, we pulled up to that spot where she had gone off-road, and we're like, oh, there's our flagging. She went in right at the site. We're like, okay, bear safety is important, but also there are 3 of us. She was behaving normally. She was scared of the trucks, had run off. We weren't too concerned, but we're going to make some noise a little bit as we're getting our gear ready. We hear her kind of meandering off into the brush, so we're getting ready to just go ahead and set up our site as planned. Right as we're about to step off the road, we turn and look, and this bear had come full circle all the way back around to the road just behind where we had parked the trucks. And we're like, well, that's a little odd. That's not what we expected to happen. We're like, maybe she's smelling the bait that we just unpacked and she's curious. And so we need to kind of haze this bear and make sure she doesn't come and approach us while we're trying to set up our site. We start clapping. If you know what to do around a bear, if you want them to go away, you get big, you get loud, shout whatever you need to get that bear's attention. Make sure they know that they should not continue to approach. And so we would stomp towards her and she would kind of back off. But then every time we got quiet, she would start approaching the trucks again. And we were like, what the heck? Okay, this is weird and not good. And most of these bears, especially on the coast, are not super habituated to humans. They'll usually run off, though. It was very odd that this one kept on approaching the truck. And so we were finally like, all right, one more push. We'll try and scare her off. And so we started stomping again, and we're banging machetes, and we're like screaming at this bear. And as we got quiet, we hear her making this little grunt noise, looking up at this one tree just off to the side, right above where we'd parked our truck. We look at the tree, and we look at her, and we look up the tree. And up in the tree, of course, there's 2 little bear cubs that she was just very politely trying to come back and collect. Because what had happened was she had treed her cubs when she heard the trucks coming. She had run off to cause a diversion or just get out of the way. And she was just coming back to get her cubs. In this case, we were the aggressors. We were very rudely shouting at her. And as soon as we realized what happened, we were like, oh, okay. And so we backed away and gave her some space.
If you've ever seen a black bear, you know that when they stand up, they look kind of human. Can you tell us, have people ever asked you weird questions about the black bears or anything like that?
I suspect that a lot of the Bigfoot Sasquatch sightings are related to seeing a shadow of a bear standing at a long distance away. We definitely had some interest from some folks that were curious what we would do if we ever found primate hair in our hair snares. And unfortunately for them, we only really focus on the black bear hair that we collect. So can neither confirm nor deny the existence of Sasquatch in the coastal North Carolina forests.
You heard it here first. We're letting down the cryptid hunters
I know.
right now.
I know.
What other field positions have you worked?
Yeah, like the big ones I did were out in New Mexico. I was out looking for spotted owls, so lots of nighttime field work. I worked up in North Dakota for a little bit. I was doing a summer. It was for a project focused on bees. We were looking at European honeybees and apiaries and how they foraged for different resources before the growing season, because it's a big agricultural state. We also did like prescribed burns and nest checks for ground nesting birds and insect surveys with moths and butterflies. You end up doing all sorts of stuff. And then my most recent fieldwork before coming up to North Carolina was down in Texas. I was doing my master's program on wildlife crossing structures down on the U.S.-Mexico border. That's probably where I got the most relevant experience, is doing camera trapping for the mammal community, which, yeah, has a lot of similarities to hair snare work where you're going out and sighting. It's still non-invasive data collection, but lots of similar fieldwork skills that you put to use there.
You mentioned you guys use machetes. You're having black bear run-ins. Fieldwork is no joke. It sounds pretty intense. What would you tell somebody who wants to start doing fieldwork, especially for like ecology? How do you prepare for this?
I feel like I kind of self-trained a lot just because fieldwork lines up with what I do for fun anyways. For me, that's just like, oh, well, I like backpacking. That's basically the same thing. So there's certain things like knowing how to treat water or navigate off trail, or, you know, there's all sorts of skills that you pick up from backpacking or hiking, or some folks have a background with hunting. There's lots of ways where you can kind of combine those hobbies with the professional side of it. It sometimes can be tricky if you don't have those interests or that background to rely on to know how to do those skills already. I definitely encourage people to go out and do as many different like tech jobs as you can. Go do the fun, exciting ones while you still maybe have less commitments at home, like no pets, no family stuff to deal with. Do the tech cycle. Just pick up as many skills as you can from that. There's lots of ways you can kind of build that fieldwork resume, if you will. I've been in field jobs where you don't get a lot of training or preparation, but I really wanted to make sure for our project, especially with how many technicians we had, that we did do a good bit of training at the outset of the season so that people were prepared to deal with all the curveballs that fieldwork can throw at you. We try to go over bear safety, even though it very rarely came up as any sort of real issue during the season. How to properly use bear spray, which we had available. What to look out for in the field, poison ivy, venomous snakes. A lot of technicians we hired were actually from outside of North Carolina. So we wanted to make sure that everyone was prepared to deal with a July field season in North Carolina, especially out on the coast.
So we've talked a lot about fieldwork. We've talked a lot about science. We're going to pivot a little bit. I know that you're an NC Courage fan. What are you most looking forward to this season?
I'm just hoping to get out to some more games and tailgate some more. I've been talking with some people about getting season tickets. I'm excited for summer.
Yeah.
Which I never thought I'd say in North Carolina.
NC Courage, for those who don't know, is a women's soccer team in the National Women's Soccer League. They're here in the Triangle.
They play at Wake Med Soccer Park.
Yeah. And if you're in Raleigh, highly recommend going to the games. They're really fun.
I love just going, not just for our players, but you can see like all sorts of international talent across all the teams they're playing. Like all these U.S. national women's team players. And they play right here in Cary.
We're going to close things off.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you, what is the last thing that gave you some hope?
The other day, I was up in Pisgah National Forest and I heard frogs calling. I found a snake the other day out at Umstead State Park. It was like a little red-bellied. So it's like, oh, the herps are back. We're back. We're back outside. Let's go.
Love to hear it.
Yeah.
The CASC podcast is organized by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and produced with an immense amount of help by the NC State University Libraries team. The USGS Climate Adaptation Science Center's mission is to deliver science that is useful and used to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to changing climates.